The Rothschild Conservatory was a place of echoes. The halls whispered with the ghosts of scales played for centuries, the murmur of students discussing concertos over coffee, and the soft, perpetual padding of feet on polished marble. It was a temple to tradition, and its high priests were the instructors, Maestro Griggs and Professor Lin. Maestro Griggs was a man built like a cello, tall and solid, with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to vibrate in your chest. He believed in order, in history, in the sacred text of the sheet music. Professor Lin, sharp and graceful as a violin bow, was different. She believed in fire, in competition, in the raw spark of talent that needed to be shaped, often through pressure. They were an unlikely pair, but they shared one core belief. The conservatory was a proving ground, and respect was earned through demonstrated mastery, never given freely. Into this world came a new student. She was 19, with quiet eyes that seemed to take in everything and give nothing back. Her name was Elara Vance, a transfer from a small, unremarkable college out west, arriving on a scholarship nobody had quite heard of. From her first day in the advanced music theory seminar, she was a puzzle. She sat in the back, always. She never raised her hand. When Griggs, in his booming voice, posed a complex question about Batch's counterpoint, her gaze would drift to the large window, watching the rain slide down the pane as if listening to a private melody. When Professor Lin called on her directly, her answers, when they came, were correct but delivered in such a soft, hesitant tone they bordered on apologetic. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't unprepared. She was just absent. To the other students, she was a minor mystery, soon forgotten in daily scramble for practice room time and the instructor's approval. But to Griggs and Lin, her silence began to curdle into something else. "It's not shyness," Professor Lin said one afternoon, stirring a sharp black coffee in their shared office. The room smelled of old paper and lemon-wood polish. "It's disdain. She sits there as if our lessons are beneath her." Maestro Griggs sighed, polishing his glasses on his vest. "Perhaps she is simply overwhelmed. The pace here is unlike anything she's known." "Her file says proficient," Lin countered, tapping a manila folder on the desk. "But proficient doesn't earn the Eldridge Scholarship. There's a backer. There must be. She's a placeholder, taking a spot from someone with real passion." This was the unspoken sore point. The Eldridge was a small, private grant, and its selection committee was opaque. To Lin, it suggested connections, not competence. Griggs, while less suspicious, was annoyed by her lack of engagement. Music, to him, was a conversation across time, and this girl refused to speak. Their shared frustration found its focus in the weekly practical session. Held in a bright, high-ceilinged room with 10 pianos, it was where theory met the keyboard. Students were expected to prepare short pieces, demonstrating technical progress. On that particular Thursday, a gray light filtered through the windows. One by one, students performed. There was a confident, flashy rendition of a Chopin prelude from a boy with nervous energy. A careful, note-perfect Mozart sonata from a girl who memorized everything. Then it was Elara's turn. She walked to the assigned piano, her posture seeming to fold inward. She opened her folder and, after a painful pause, placed the sheet music for a simple Bergmüller etude on the stand, a piece suitable for an early intermediate student. A few students exchanged glances. In this advanced class, it was like bringing a butter knife to a sword fight. She began to play. The notes were correct, clean even, but the performance was bloodless. It had no dynamics, no feeling, no rise or fall. It was sound, not music. When she finished, there was a polite, thin smattering of applause that died quickly. Maestro Griggs felt a warm flush of disappointment. Professor Lin saw confirmation as Elara gathered her music. Looking ready to flee back to her seat, Griggs spoke. His voice was calm, pedantic. Adequate note accuracy, Miss Vance. But music, you must remember, lives in the space between the notes. In the breath, the intention. Professor Lin saw an opportunity. A chance to crack the shell, to see what, if anything, was inside. She stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She walked to the grand piano at the front of the room, the instrument reserved for instructors. On the music stand lay a thick, well-worn book of advanced repertoire. Maestro Griggs is correct, Lynn said, her voice cutting the air. Perhaps the etude is insufficient to truly gauge your understanding. She flipped through the pages with a sure hand. The room was silent, all students sensing a shift. Elara stood frozen by her piano. A deer sensing a predator. Lynn found the page she wanted. She carefully removed the sheet music, a dense, intimidating forest of black notes and complex markings. She walked over to Elara and held it out. Rachmaninoff's Etude Tableau in C minor, Professor Lin announced, for the benefit of the class. A low murmur went through the room. They all knew it. It was a beast. A torrent of octaves, roaring chords, and frantic, despairing melodies. It wasn't just hard to play. It was hard to listen to. It was emotional warfare on the keyboard. Let us see what you're truly made of. Miss Vance, Lynn said, a tight, professional smile on her lips. Consider it a leap forward in your studies. We'll expect you to present it at tomorrow's masterclass. The air was sucked from the room. The masterclass was a formal event. All the advanced students and faculty would be there. It was a showcase, not a practice session. To assign this piece, with one day's preparation, was not a challenge. It was a public execution. Elara looked at the music, then up at Professor Lin's unreadable face, then to Maestro Griggs. He adjusted his vest, cleared his throat, and gave a slow, grave nod. He saw Lin's tactic as harsh, but a part of him, the traditionalist who believed in tough love, agreed. The girl needed a wake-up call. She needed to be humbled before she could truly learn. Yes, Griggs boomed, sealing her fate. A formidable task. It will require dedication. Let it be a lesson in the scale of the work we do here. Elara's fingers trembled as she took the heavy paper. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just nodded, a tiny, defeated motion, and walked back to her seat, clutching the Rachmaninoff like a death sentence. The class resumed, but the energy had changed. Whispers flitted between students during the next performance. They stole glances at the girl in the back, who sat staring at the impossible music in her lap. Some felt a prick of sympathy. Most felt the cold, curious thrill of anticipation. Tomorrow's masterclass, usually a dignified affair, now promised drama. As the session ended and students filed out, Elara was the last to leave. The two instructors remained, standing by the grand piano. Perhaps too severe, Lynn, Griggs murmured, watching the empty doorway where the girl had vanished. Or perhaps not severe enough, Lynn replied, closing the repertoire book with a definitive thud. If she has the privilege to be here, she must bear the weight of it. Tomorrow, she will either rise to the occasion or she will understand her place. Either way, the mystery of Miss Vance will be solved. They left the room, their footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. Their plan was set. They believed they were administering a bitter but necessary medicine. They were utterly unaware that they had just handed a lit match to a woman who had spent years sitting on a powder keg of genius and grief, and had just been given no choice but to let it all explode. The walk back to her dorm room was a blur of polished floors and distant, echoing piano notes from practice rooms. The heavy sheet music felt like a slab of stone in her hands. Elara kept her head down, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The stares of her classmates, a mix of pity and curiosity, seemed to burn into her back until she finally turned the corner into the quieter residential wing. Her room was the smallest on the corridor, a box with a narrow window that looked out onto a brick wall. It held a bed, a desk, a small bookshelf sagging with scores and history texts, and a silent electric keyboard she used for late-night note-checking. It wasn't meant for real practice. Its sound was thin and artificial. The music she was now expected to perform demanded a concert grand, an instrument of thunder and whispers, not this plastic imitation. She closed the door, and the world shrank to this silent space. The chaos of the classroom, the pressure of those watching eyes, fell away, leaving only a cold, familiar dread. She placed the Rachmaninoff music on the stand of her keyboard with hands that were finally steady. She didn't play. She just looked. The notes swam on the page, not as impossible technical challenges, but as memories. This wasn't just a difficult piece. It was a ghost. The first haunting, dissonant chords of the etude tableau were the exact sound of a rainy afternoon from another life. She was 12, curled on a huge velvet sofa in a sunlit living room that smelled of beeswax and old paper. Her mother was at the grand piano, a sleek black beast that dominated the room. She wasn't just practicing. She was wrestling with something, her body moving with the music's storm. It's not about the crashing waves. Little dove, her mother had said later, pulling Ilara onto the piano bench beside her. Ilara could still feel the warmth of her arm. Listen here, in the middle. It's about the eye of the storm. That tiny, quiet place where everything is still, even while the world is falling apart outside. That's the secret. Her mother, Evelyn Red, hadn't been just a pianist. She had been a force. Her performances were talked about in hushed, awestruck tones. And Ilara, her only child, had been her shadow, her student, her biggest fan. A prodigy herself, by the age of 10, Ilara could play circles around conservatory students. She performed at small, exclusive events, always introduced as the daughter of Evelyn Reed, a title she wore like a crown. Then the car accident. Sudden, senseless, and the music in their world stopped forever. After the funeral, the silence in the house was unbearable. The grand piano, once a living thing, became a giant, polished coffin for a joy she could never reclaim. Well-meaning people from her mother's world, agents, other musicians, family friends, talked about her legacy, about how Ilara had a duty to carry the torch. They saw her talent as an inheritance, like a piece of jewelry to be worn. But to Ilara, the piano had become inextricably linked to the pain. Every note she played felt like a betrayal, a reminder of the duet that was now a solo. The idea of performing, of being on a stage where her mother should be, where people would clap for her while she felt empty inside, made her physically sick. So she made a choice. She buried Ilara Reed. She used a forgotten family name on her mother's side, Vance. She declined all the prestigious conservatory invitations that still came based on her old reputation. Instead, she chose Rothschild precisely because it was rigorous and traditional, but not where the classical music world's brightest stars usually went. She applied for the obscure Eldridge Scholarship, which was for historical musicology, not performance. She wanted to be near the music she still loved, to understand its history, its structure, its soul, without having to be its instrument. She wanted to listen, to learn, to hide in the back of lecture halls where no one expected anything from her, and it had been working. For months, she'd been just another quiet student. A ghost among ghosts. Now, this piece. This damn piece. It was the key to a door she had locked and thrown away. Professor Lynn and Maestro Griggs thought they were giving her an impossible test. They had no idea they were handing her a diary of her own grief. A dry, hollow laugh escaped her throat. The irony was almost funny. They wanted to humble the arrogant new girl. If only they knew she wasn't arrogant, just broken. If only they knew that playing this piece, really playing it, would mean tearing open the wound she'd spent 7 years trying to seal. She sat at the silent keyboard and let her fingers hover over the plastic keys. She traced the opening moves in the air, her muscles remembering what her mind wanted to forget. The technical passages, the roaring octaves, the delicate, sorrowful melody that emerged from the chaos. Her hands knew this terrain. It was in her muscle memory, a path worn deep in her childhood. The problem wasn't whether she could play it. The problem was what would happen if she did, if she pretended to fail, if she went to the masterclass tomorrow and stumbled through a few pathetic bars before giving up. The humiliation would be crushing. She would be confirmed as a fraud, the scholarship student who didn't belong. She'd likely be asked to leave. The quiet, anonymous life she'd built would be over. And a deeper part of her rebelled against that. Her mother hadn't taught her to surrender. She'd taught her to find the eye of the storm. But if she played it because she knew she could, if she let the music out, the real music that lived in her bones, it would be a confession. The moment her hands connected with the keys with that specific authority, the moment the first true emotional phrase left the piano, anyone with half an ear would know. This wasn't a student learning a piece. This was a musician who had lived it. The whispers would start. The searching looks. The connection to a past she had fled. She was trapped. A public failure or a public unveiling. There was no third option. The gray light from the window faded into evening. She didn't turn on the lamp. She sat in the growing dark, the ghost of the music swirling around her. She could almost hear her mother's voice, not from memory, but from the very notes on the page. Asterisk, the silence in the middle, little dove. That's where you find your strength. Asterisk, but where was the silence now? The conservatory was full of noise, literal and social. Her own mind was a cacophony of fear and memory. The master class loomed, a silent, judging audience waiting for her to either fall or fly. Finally, with a sigh that came from the very bottom of her soul, she reached out. Not to the electric keyboard, but to a small framed photo on her desk, the only personal item in the room. It was a picture of her mother, not on stage, but laughing in a garden, her face turned toward the sun. Elara looked from the photo to the sheet music, then to her own hands. They were skilled hands, a pianist's hands, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. Tomorrow, she would have to use them. She would have to walk onto a stage and decide, in front of everyone, who she really was. Elara Vance, the failed student, or Elara Reed, the ghost of a genius. She had one night to find the eye of her own storm. One night to decide if she had the courage to let the world hear her thunder. The masterclass hall at Rothschild was different from the practice rooms. It held its breath. High ceilings arched over rows of polished wooden seats that faced a single majestic concert grand piano on a shallow stage. The lighting was soft, focused, like a spotlight waiting for its subject. It was a room built for judgment, for the passing down of wisdom from master to student, for moments of triumph or quiet correction. Today, the air crackled with something else. A low, electric hum of anticipation. Every seat was filled. Students from all the advanced classes were there, packed shoulder to shoulder. Even a few junior faculty members sat in the back, drawn by the unusual buzz. They all knew. The story of the quiet girl from the back row and the impossible Rachmaninoff had spread through the conservatory like a brush fire. Maestro. Griggs and Professor Lynn sat in the front row, slightly apart from the students. Griggs sat straight-backed, hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of calm expectation. Inside, he felt a twist of unease. The plan had seemed didactic yesterday, a firm but fair lesson. Now, in the solemn quiet of the full hall, it felt heavier, more like a public spectacle. He glanced at Lynn. She was checking her watch, her posture perfect, a faint, unwavering line of concentration between her brows. She felt no such doubt. She was a scientist awaiting the result of an experiment. The door at the side of the hall opened with a soft click. Every head turned. Elara walked in. She looked even smaller than usual, swallowed by the formal setting. She wore a simple, plain black dress, the kind meant to disappear. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor as she made her way to the stage steps. A few whispers followed her, sharp little sounds that faded quickly into the thick quiet. She carried the sheet music, her knuckles white on the folder. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The grand piano loomed, a beast of polished ebony. For a long moment, she just stood beside it, not touching it, as if it were a stranger. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. A student in the 3rd row shifted in his seat. The sound of fabric scraping against wood was shockingly loud. Finally, she moved. She placed the music on the stand, carefully aligning the pages. She adjusted the bench, sliding it a fraction of an inch forward, then back. She was stalling, and everyone could feel it. The tension in the room tightened another notch. Professor Lin's lips thinned slightly. Elara sat down. She placed her hands in her lap, took a slow breath that shuddered a little, and then lifted them to the keys. Her posture was all wrong. It was hunched, defensive, as if waiting for a blow. She began. The first notes were a disaster. They were timid, halting. The powerful opening chords, which should have been a declaration of war, came out as weak, disconnected thumps. She fumbled the transition, her fingers slipping, hitting a blatantly wrong note that hung in the air, ugly and plain. A few students winced. Some looked down at their hands, feeling second-hand embarrassment so acute it was painful. Maestro Griggs closed his eyes for a brief second. This was worse than he'd imagined. It wasn't just a failure. It was a car crash in slow motion. He felt a surge of regret. This was cruel. He had allowed this. Professor Lin watched, her face now completely unreadable. The experiment was yielding its expected result, but there was no satisfaction in it, only a cold, hollow confirmation. Elara played on, or tried to. The music staggered, a wounded animal dragging itself across the stage. She reached the first frenzied run of notes, a cascade that should have sounded like falling water, and it came out as a jumbled, muddy mess. Her shoulders were up around her ears. She was fighting the piano and losing. Then, something happened. It was at the first moment of true melodic release. After the stormy introduction, the music pulls back for a second, offering a brief, sorrowful song, a single clear voice rising from the chaos. It was the part her mother had called the I. Elara's fingers found those notes, and for the first time, they didn't just press the keys. They touched them. The sound changed. It was subtle at first. The note was just a note, but it had a different color. It had a warmth, a vibration that seemed to come from deep inside the piano and deep inside her. It held for a fraction of a second longer than written, bleeding into the silence with a heartbreaking sweetness. Elara's head lifted a fraction of an inch. She played the next phrase of the melody, and now the difference was undeniable. The technique was suddenly, effortlessly there. The notes were perfectly connected, a seamless line of sound that sang. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the dead quiet hall. It was a sound so full of naked longing and memory that it caught the breath in several throats. A boy in the 2nd row, who had been slouching, slowly sat up straight. Elara's body began to change. The hunched, defensive curve of her spine straightened. The tense, raised shoulders dropped and settled. Her arms, which had been stiff and mechanical, now moved from the core of her body with a natural, powerful grace. It was as if she had shed a heavy, invisible coat. The melody ended, and the music plunges back into the tempest. This time, when the furious octaves and roaring chords returned, they did not stumble Dot. They exploded. Dot, it was no longer a student playing a difficult piece. It was the storm itself, unleashed. Her hands were a blur, but every note in the chaotic whirlwind was crisp, clear, and ferociously intentional. The power coming from the piano was physical, a wave of sound that vibrated in the floorboards. It wasn't just technical mastery, though that was blindingly obvious. It was the emotion. The rage, the grief, the desperate struggle, all of it was in the music, raw and real and overwhelming. Professor Lin's professional detachment shattered. Her eyes widened. She was leaning forward now, her body rigid. This was impossible. No one, not even a seasoned professional, could flip a switch like that. Not from that halting start, too. To this, Maestro Griggs was staring, his mouth slightly open. His musician's ear was analyzing the performance, and it was breaking all his understanding. The phrasing was idiosyncratic, deeply personal. The way she lingered on that one resolving chord, the brutal attack on a particular dissonance, these were interpretive choices, the marks of a mature artist, not a student learning notes. Alara was gone. She wasn't in the Rothschild Masterclass Hall anymore. She was in that sunlit room with the velvet sofa. She was at the funeral. She was in the 7 years of silence that followed. She was playing for her mother. She was playing because of her mother. Every ounce of love, every shred of loss, every moment of quiet longing in her small dorm room was flowing out through her fingers and into the keys. The final section of the piece is a relentless, driving climb to a devastating climax. Alara attacked it with a terrifying, beautiful fury. The piano seemed to shake under the force. And then the final hammering chords. They weren't just played. They were pronounced. Each one was a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The last note rang out, a deep, reverberating boom that faded slowly into absolute silence. Dot, it was a silence unlike the one that had greeted her arrival. That had been an empty silence, waiting to be filled. This was a full silence, a stunned, breathless void where the echo of the music still seemed to hang. Alara's hands fell from the keyboard into her lap. Her head was bowed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was drained, completely spent. The transformation was over. The powerful, connected artist was gone, and the small, pale girl in the black dress was back. But no one in the room saw that girl anymore. They saw the person who had just lived a lifetime in 4 minutes. They saw a mystery that had suddenly become 1,000 times deeper. The students were frozen, some with hands half raised to clap, unsure if applause was even appropriate for something that felt so private, so monumental. Maestro Griggs and Professor Lin sat utterly still, their professional worlds tilted off their axis. The plan to humble a student had vanished, replaced by a single shocking, undeniable truth. They had not uncovered a fraud. They had awakened a genius. And now, in the ringing, sacred quiet, the only question was, who on earth was she? The silence after the final note wasn't quiet. It was a living thing, thick and heavy, pressing on everyone's ears. It was the sound of 200 people holding their breath. No one clapped. Applause felt wrong, like speaking in a cathedral. On the stage, Alara sat with her head bowed, her hands limp in her lap. The energy that had possessed her was gone, leaving behind a shell that looked fragile enough to crumble. The connection was broken. She was back in the room, and she could feel the weight of all those eyes. A hot wave of panic started to rise in her chest. She had done the very thing she swore never to do. She had let the music out. In the front row, the 2 instructors were statues, but their minds were racing at a frantic tempo. Maestro Griggs felt the world tilt. His brain, trained for decades to analyze technique and expression, was short-circuiting. The sheer physical power of those octaves flawless. The control in the softest passages absolute. But it was the artistry that dismantled him. The way she had made the piano weep in that middle section, that wasn't taught. That was lived. It was the playing of someone who had a deep, personal conversation with grief. A 19-year-old scholarship student from nowhere should not sound like that. His earlier unease curdled into a sickening sense of shame. He had tried to administer a lesson, and instead he had been given one. A devastating, breathtaking lesson in his own presumption. Beside him, Professor Lin's thoughts were sharper, more forensic. Shock was there, yes, but it was quickly overrun by a burning need to solve this. The performance was an impossibility. Therefore, the premise was wrong. The girl was not who they thought she was. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the slumped figure on stage. The pale face, the dark hair, the way she had seemed to physically transform when the music took over. It was like watching two different people. A memory clicked. A name, whispered in the classical music world years ago, attached to tragedy. A child prodigy who disappeared from the scene entirely after a terrible loss. With a sudden, jerky movement, Lin reached for the leather satchel at her feet. The rustle of the bag seemed deafening in the hush. She pulled out a sleek tablet, waking it up. Her fingers, usually so precise, fumbled as she opened a browser. Griggs glanced at her, a question in his eyes, but she was already lost in the search. She typed quickly, her brow furrowed. Evelyn Reed car accident daughter. The search results populated. News articles, obituaries, a charity foundation set up in the pianist's name. Lin's finger scrolled, tapped. She found a feature article from a music magazine, titled A Legacy Interrupted. It was about the tragic loss of the renowned pianist Evelyn Reed and the promising future of her only child, a young daughter who was also a stunning talent. There was a picture, a photo from a competition years ago. A girl of about 12, holding a trophy almost as big as she was, smiling a shy, proud smile next to her beaming mother. The girl's face was younger, rounder, but the eyes were the same. The solemn, deep-set eyes that had stared out the window in music theory class. Professor Lin's blood went cold, then hot. She zoomed in on the caption beneath the photo. Asterisk Evelyn Reed and her daughter Elara. After winning the prestigious Nordstrom Young Artists Prize. Asterisk Elara. Not Vance, Reed. Asterisk, she inhaled sharply, the sound a hiss in the quiet room. She turned the tablet and thrust it toward Griggs, pointing at the name and at the girl on stage. Griggs took the tablet. He looked at the vibrant, smiling girl in the photo. He looked at the pale, drained young woman on the stage, who was now stiffly closing the lid over the piano keys. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was more than resemblance. It was identity. The pieces of the puzzle, the silence, the seeming detachment, the obscure scholarship, the otherworldly talent slammed together with an almost physical force. He looked back at Lin, his face ashen. All the color had drained from his own. The word formed on his lips without sound. Read. Meanwhile, a ripple was moving through the student body. The stunned silence was breaking into a low buzz of whispers. They didn't have the facts, but they had ears. They had just witnessed a performance that belonged on a world stage, not in a student masterclass. The boy who had sat up straight during the melody leaned over to his friend. That wasn't just good, he whispered, his voice hushed with awe. That was like hearing a recording. But Liv? Who is she? His friend, a violinist with a sharp eye for detail, shook his head. Did you see her hands? The way she moved? That's not something you learn here. She's played that piece 1,000 times before. She's performed it. For real. The whispers grew, speculations flying. Asterisk, she must be a ringer. Maybe she's a professional testing the teachers. Maybe she's someone famous incognito. Asterisk then, from the front row, a voice cut through the murmur. It wasn't loud, but it was clear and carried the weight of revelation. It was the violinist's friend, who had been staring intently at Alara, his mind making connections. He'd been to a summer festival years ago where they showed a documentary about prodigies. A face flashed in his memory. Alara Reed, he said, the name tentative at first. Then, with more certainty, he said it again, louder. That's Alara Reed. The name landed in the room like a stone in a pond. Reed? It took a second for the younger students. But the older ones, the ones who lived and breathed classical music history, their eyes went wide. Reed, as in Evelyn Reed, the legend. The name was a monument. And her daughter, the prodigy who vanished. Every single head swiveled back to the stage. Alara had just stood up. She was turning to leave, her movements slow and weary, as if carrying a great weight. She heard the name. She froze mid-step, her back to the audience. A full-body flinch, so small but so visible to everyone watching. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. The whisper became a wave. Evelyn Reed's daughter. Oh my God, she just disappeared. That's why. They had no idea. The murmurs weren't mean now. They were stunned, reverent, shocked. The narrative had flipped completely. This wasn't a story about an arrogant student being taken down a peg. This was a story about a ghost walking among them. A hidden genius provoked into revealing herself by teachers who were completely in the dark. Professor. Lynn slowly lowered the tablet onto her lap. She looked at Griggs, and for the first time, there was no competitive edge, no certainty in her gaze. There was only a hollow, dawning horror at the magnitude of their error. They hadn't been teaching a mediocre student. They had been ignoring a living piece of musical history. They had pushed and prodded at a wound they never knew existed. Maestro Griggs could not meet her eyes. He stared at his own hands, the hands of a teacher who believed he could see potential, who believed in hard lessons. He had orchestrated a humiliation for a young woman who had already faced a loss so profound it made. His little musical test looked like a cruel joke. The shame was a physical ache in his chest. On the stage, Alara finally moved again. She didn't look at the whispering crowd. She didn't look at the stricken faces of her instructors in the front row. She simply walked, step by slow step, toward the side door from which she had entered. The silence returned, but now it was a silence of awe and collective disbelief. Parting to let her pass Dot, as her hand reached for the door handle, the reality of the situation settled over the hall. The mystery of the quiet girl in the back row was solved. And the answer was far more extraordinary and far more heartbreaking than anyone could have guessed. The teachers had forced a performance, unaware of the genius they were challenging. Now they were aware. And the sound of that awareness was the deafening, respectful silence that followed Alara Reed out of the room. The heavy door of the masterclass hall shut behind her with a soft, final sound. Inside, the silence was already breaking into a tidal wave of whispers, questions, and stunned exclamations. But out in the cool, dim hallway, there was only quiet. The sharp echo of her own shoes on the marble floor, and the sound of her blood rushing in her ears. Alara walked. She didn't know where she was going. She just moved, one foot in front of the other, putting distance between herself and the room where she had just torn herself open. The performance had emptied her out. The secret was gone. The name was out. The strange, protective shell of Alara Vance had shattered, and she was standing in the rubble, exposed. She found herself in the old East Wing corridor, a quieter part of the conservatory lined with portraits of past composers and benefactors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, not with judgment now, but with a kind of solemn understanding. She stopped, her hand resting against the cool wall, and finally let out the breath she felt she'd been holding for 7 years. Back in the hall, the atmosphere was chaotic. Students were standing, talking animatedly in hushed, urgent tones. The performance was all anyone could talk about, but the name was the real earthquake. A senior, a cellist who remembered the news of Evelyn Reed's death, was explaining it to a group of first years. She just vanished. Everyone thought she'd quit music entirely. No one knew where she went. At the front of the room, the two instructors were islands of stillness in the moving crowd. Maestro Griggs finally stood, his joints feeling stiff and old. He didn't look at the students. He looked at the closed lid of the grand piano, as if he could still see the ghost of the music hovering above it. "We have to. We should go after her," he said, his voice rough. Professor Lin was still seated, staring straight ahead at the empty stage. The confident, sharp-edged woman from yesterday was gone. In her place was someone unnervingly still. "And say what?" she asked, the question flat and quiet. "Our apologies. We didn't realize you were someone important." "That would make it worse." "This was my fault," Griggs murmured, more to himself than to her. "I allowed it. I thought it was discipline." "I designed it," Lynn corrected, her tone devoid of its usual competitive edge. "It was just a statement of fact. I thought I was exposing a fraud. Instead, I provoked a resurrection." She finally looked up at him, and her eyes were haunted. She didn't want this. She hid here for a reason. And we, in our supreme arrogance, tore the roof off her shelter. A few brave students lingered, hoping the teachers might say something, offer some explanation. But the instructors had none to give. They were students themselves in that moment, learning a harsh lesson in humility. Ilara ended up in the conservatory's small interior courtyard, a square of gray sky and trimmed hedges. She sat on a cold stone bench, the numbness starting to recede, replaced by a tremor in her hands. What now? Would they ask her to leave? Would they treat her like a museum piece? The thought of walking back into that theory class, with everyone knowing, was unbearable. She heard the courtyard door open, but she didn't look up. Heavy, measured footsteps approached, then stopped a respectful distance away. It was Maestro Griggs. He stood there for a moment, a tall, awkward figure in the gray light. "Miss V." "Miss Reed," he began, then stopped, correcting himself. The name hung in the damp air. She didn't respond. He started again, his voice struggling to find its familiar authority and failing. "What you played. It was not a student's performance. It was a master's. I have not heard playing of that. Emotional truth. In many years." He swallowed. "Your mother. She would have been immensely proud." It was the worst thing he could have said, and the only true thing. A hot tear escaped and traced a path down Ilara's cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but said nothing. Griggs saw the tear. His own eyes stung. He had come to apologize, but the words felt cheap and small in the face of what had happened. "This institution? We failed you. We saw a mystery and tried to solve it with a hammer, not with care. For that, I am profoundly sorry." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain or justify. He simply stood there, offering the apology into the silence. And then, when she gave no sign of hearing it, he turned and walked slowly back inside. His shoulders slumped. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Lighter, quicker footsteps. Professor Lin did not sit, nor did she come as close. She stood near the hedge, her arms crossed, not in defiance, but as if holding herself together. "I looked for weakness," she said, her voice clearer than Griggs's. but just as stripped bare. I was so sure I saw it. What I was actually seeing was strength. A different kind. The strength to carry that talent and that loss, and to choose silence. She paused, choosing her next words with more care than she had chosen the Rachmaninoff. You are not failing my class by being quiet. I was failing you by not wondering why. Alara looked up then, just briefly. Lynn's face was pale, her professional mask completely gone. There was no cunning there, no strategy. Only a raw, uncomfortable respect. The conservatory is yours, if you want it, Lynn said. Not as a hiding place. Not as a student, but as whatever you need it to be. Lessons, coaching, access to the archives, a practice room. Or none of it. The choice is entirely yours. She took a deep breath. My door, for what it's worth, is open. Not as your professor, but perhaps, if you ever wished, as a colleague. With that, she gave a single, slight nod and left Alara alone, the choice. It was back in her hands. It hadn't been for so long. First, the choice had been taken by tragedy. Then, she had made the choice to hide. Then, the teachers had taken the choice away, forcing her hand. Now, it was returned to her. She sat there as the afternoon light began to fade. The trembling in her hands slowly stilled. When she finally stood, her legs were steady. She walked back inside, not to the dormitory to hide, but through the main halls. Students saw her. They stopped talking as she passed. But the looks were not of pity or curiosity anymore. They were looks of awe, of respect, some even of apology. She met no one's eyes, but she didn't look at the floor either. She went to the practice room wing. She stood outside the door of room 1B, a small, worn room with an old but decent upright piano. It was the one she sometimes used late at night. She took the key from her pocket, unlocked it, and went inside. She didn't close the door fully. She left it open a crack. She sat at the piano. She didn't play Rachmaninoff. She didn't play anything from her past. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play a simple, wandering melody. It was something new, something of her own making. It was hesitant at first, a question. Then it grew a little more sure, finding a path. The notes drifted out into the hallway. A student walking by slowed, then stopped, listening. She recognized the player now. She listened for a moment, then smiled softly and walked on, leaving the music to float freely on the air. Down the hall, in his office, Maestro Griggs heard the distant, exploratory music. He put down his pen and listened. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a beginning. He closed his eyes, and for the first time that day, the knot of shame in his chest began to loosen. Just a little dot in her own office. Professor Lynn heard it too. She paused, looking up from the tablet that still showed the old photo of a smiling girl and her mother. She listened to the tentative, living notes from the practice room. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips, something that felt unfamiliar. It wasn't triumph. It was relief. Ilara played her simple melody, her eyes on the keys, then on the open door. The world had found her. She had not chosen it, but she had met it. And she had not broken. She was still here. And for now, the music she played was not a ghost, and not a performance. It was just hers. A quiet sound in a quiet room, with the door left open, just a little, to the future.